1988, a brilliant black doctor on the verge of a cancer cure vanished from his research lab. The police, influenced by a corporate rival, called him unstable and said he abandoned his family. For 10 years, that lie was the only story, and his name was erased from medical history. Then, a record-breaking heat wave caused a chemical leak at the defunct facility, exposing a hidden vault and a 10-year-old secret that was still breathing. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. In 1988, deep within one of its most prestigious medical research centers, Dr. Elias Monroe was on the verge of giving that future a gift beyond measure. At 39, he was a man of quiet brilliance, a pediatric oncologist whose gentle demeanor belied a fierce, unshakable ethical core. His work was not just a career. It was a calling, a deeply personal war against the cruelest of diseases. For 3 years, he had worked tirelessly in his small lab at the Ashcroft Children's Cancer Research Center, funded by a patchwork of university grants and philanthropic donations. He had been investigating a rare orchid found deep in the Amazon rainforest, a plant whose chemical compounds were rumored in indigenous medicine to have life-sustaining properties. After thousands of hours of painstaking work, he had isolated a compound that was showing results that were nothing short of miraculous. In early trials on pediatric brain tissue samples, the compound was not just suppressing tumor growth. It was causing a significant number of the cancer cells to self-destruct, all without the devastatingly toxic side effects of conventional chemotherapy. It was gentle, targeted, and impossibly promising. The news of his breakthrough, published in a small, respected oncology journal, did not stay quiet for long. It caught the attention of Verexin Labs, a pharmaceutical giant with a reputation for aggressive acquisitions and blockbuster profits. They summoned Elias to their gleaming corporate headquarters, a steel and glass tower that seemed to sneer at the modest brick buildings of the Ashcroft Center. The meeting was held in a top-floor boardroom with a panoramic view of the city. Across a vast, polished table sat Dr. Bernard Kessler, Verexin's chief science officer and a former board member of the Ashcroft Center. He was a man whose smile was a carefully calibrated instrument of persuasion. "Elias, my boy, this is magnificent work," Kessler said, his voice smooth and paternal, gesturing for Elias to sit. "Truly revolutionary. We've been following your papers for months. The precision of the mechanism, it's the kind of elegant science that comes along once in a generation. And we at Verexin want to be the ones to bring it to the world." He slid a heavy, leather-bound folder across the table. It was a licensing offer, a document filled with staggering numbers, patent agreements, and clauses that would give Verexin exclusive, ironclad control over the compound. Elias looked at the folder, but didn't touch it. "Thank you, Bernard," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I appreciate the sentiment, but my work isn't for sale." Kessler chuckled, a low, practiced sound of indulgent wisdom. "Elias, don't be so hasty. This isn't just about money. Although, let's be clear, the numbers in that folder would make you a very, very wealthy man. This is about legacy. Think about it. The Monroe compound. Your name on the patent. A Nobel Prize isn't out of the question. We have the resources, the infrastructure to make you a legend. The only legacy I'm interested in is a world with more survivors," Elias replied, his gaze unwavering. "My work was funded by public grants, Bernard. On nonprofit time, at a nonprofit institution. The compound doesn't belong to me, and it certainly doesn't belong to Verexin. It belongs to the public." Kessler's smile tightened, the first sign of a crack in his charming facade. "The public doesn't have a billion-dollar R&D pipeline, Elias. The public doesn't have a global distribution network. You have a promising molecule. We can turn it into a medicine. You want to run open-source trials? Fine. The NIH is a slow, bureaucratic beast. You'll be buried in paperwork for 5 years before you can treat a single patient. We can have this fast-tracked and in production in 18 months. Isn't that what you want? To save lives as quickly as possible." It was a clever, seductive argument, the appeal to his own noble goal. But Elias saw the trap within it. "At what cost, Bernard?" A price tag so high that only the wealthy can afford it? A 10-year exclusive patent that stifles further independent research? No. The data will be shared with everyone, universities, research hospitals, even our competitors. The faster everyone can work on this, the faster we can refine it, improve it, and get it to every child who needs it, not just the ones whose parents have the right insurance. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. Kessler's mask of friendly mentorship dissolved completely, revealing the cold, hard face of a predator. He leaned forward, his voice losing its warmth, replaced by a low, threatening intensity. That's a noble, but incredibly naive sentiment, Elias. You are sitting on a multi-billion-dollar molecule. You don't just give it away. That's not how the world works. You're a brilliant scientist, but you are a terrible businessman. And in this world, the businessmen decide what gets made. It's how my world works, Elias said, standing up, the finality in his voice clear. I'm sorry to have wasted your time. He walked out of the boardroom, leaving the leather-bound folder and the future it represented untouched on the table. He didn't see the cold, calculating fury in Kessler's eyes as he watched him go. Days later, Elias went to the Ashcroft Center on a Saturday afternoon to retrieve the last of his tissue samples for the next phase of his research. He told his wife, Althea, he would be home in time for dinner. He never arrived. When he didn't answer his pager, a frantic Althea called the police. 2 officers arrived at her home, their expressions a mixture of boredom and impatience. She explained to her husband was the importance of his work, her deep, gut-wrenching fear that something was terribly wrong. They took her statement with a kind of weary condescension. The next morning, the lead detective on the case received a concerned and confidential phone call from a highly respected source, Dr. Bernard Kessler of Verge Labs. Kessler explained that while he had the utmost respect for Dr. Monroe, the man had been under immense professional pressure lately. He had grown erratic, obsessed with his research, making unrealistic and grandiose claims. He worried that Elias, in his unstable state, might have simply walked away from it all. The phone call was a quiet, professional assassination. It framed the narrative. When Althea called the station again, the detective's tone had changed. He was no longer just dismissive. He was placating. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "We're looking into it. But you have to understand, it's not uncommon for a man under that kind of stress to just need some time away. He'll probably turn up in a few days when he's cooled off." Her pleas, her certainty that her husband would never abandon her and their son, Kareem, were treated as the protestations of a hysterical wife, unable to accept the truth. Within months, the official story was set. Verge Labs, in a move praised by the financial press, acquired the parent company of the Ashcroft Center and, citing operational redundancies, announced the closure of the underperforming facility. Dr. Elias Monroe, the brilliant oncologist, was officially declared a missing person, a man who had likely cracked under the pressure of his own genius and abandoned his family. His name was quietly scrubbed from the NIH trial database. The world forgot him. His wife and son did not. The 10 years that followed were a long, slow grind of grief and injustice. For Althea Monroe, the world became a muted, gray landscape, the vibrant colors of her life with Elias bleached out by his absence. The official story, that her brilliant, ethical, loving husband had simply walked away, was a wound that never closed, a constant, insulting reminder of a system that had refused to listen to her. She refused to let him be erased. Her defiance was a quiet, solitary, and relentless ritual. In the spring of 1998, on the 10th anniversary of his disappearance, she walked into the same downtown police precinct. The building smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, the same smells she remembered from a decade ago. The desk sergeant was a new man, young and impatient, with a thick mustache and a weary expression. "Can I help you?" he asked, not looking up from his paperwork. "Yes," Althea said, her voice steady, practiced. "I'm here to file a missing persons report, an update to an existing case." The sergeant sighed, finally looking up. He recognized her from the year before. The crazy lady with the 10-year-old cold case. Ma'am, we've been over this. The case is inactive. There are no new leads. I am aware, Althea said, her dignity a shield against his condescension. But he is still missing, and I'm still his wife. So I will file the report. She slid a photograph across the counter. It was a picture of Elias, smiling, taken on their last anniversary. His name is Dr. Elias Monroe. He is 5 feet, 11 inches tall. Black hair, brown eyes. Last seen wearing a gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase. The sergeant took the photo, his expression a mixture of pity and annoyance. Look, Mrs. Monroe, he said, his voice softening with a false kindness she had come to despise. Don't you think it's time to let this go? It's been 10 years. He's not coming back. You need to move on with your life. Althea looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. When the person you love most in the world is stolen from you, detective, you don't move on. You hold on. You hold on to the truth, even when no one else will. Now, are you going to take my report, or do I need to speak with your supervisor? The sergeant, defeated by her unshakable resolve, sighed and pulled out a fresh form. The annual report was her testament. It was her way of telling the world, and telling herself, that he was not forgotten. He was missing, not gone. For their son, Kareem, the disappearance of his father was the single, defining event of his life. He was 20 when his father vanished, a bright, idealistic college student. The man he had worshipped, the gentle giant who had taught him to love science and to always question authority, had been stolen from him, his legacy tarnished by a lazy, insidious lie. The injustice of it all lit a fire in him. He changed his major from pre-med to pre-law. His father had been a healer. Kareem would become a fighter. In 1998, he was a 30-year-old law student at Georgetown, spending his nights not in bars, but in the hushed, cavernous halls of the university library. He was surrounded by stacks of legal texts and boxes of documents obtained through years of Freedom of Information Act requests. It was a lonely, frustrating pursuit, a war fought in dusty archives and on microfiche readers. He was going through a set of heavily redacted documents related to the corporate merger between Verexon and the parent company of Ashcroft. Most of it was useless, entire pages blacked out with thick, insulting lines. But Kareem was his father's son. He was meticulous, patient, and relentless. He wasn't just reading the text. He was studying the redactions themselves, looking for patterns. Late one night, under the low, green glow of a library lamp, he found it. On a page detailing the closure of redundant research assets. A single line had been imperfectly redacted. The black bar was slightly misaligned, revealing a few letters above and below it. Kareem leaned closer, his heart beginning to pound. He could make out a phrase, an acronym. EPH protocol. It meant nothing to him. But it was something. It was a tangible clue, a piece of language rescued from a sea of black ink. He wrote it down on a fresh legal pad, circling it again and again. EPH protocol. It was the first real breadcrumb he had found in 10 years of searching. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew it was a thread, and he was determined to pull on it until the entire conspiracy unraveled. He became convinced that Elias hadn't just vanished. He had been deliberately disappeared. The police had failed them. The system had failed them. Kareem knew that if the truth was ever to be found, he would have to be the one to find it. For 10 years, he had chipped away at the wall of silence, his law books his weapons, his father's memory his fuel. The summer of 1998 descended on Georgia like a fever. A record-breaking heat wave gripped the state for weeks, the asphalt turning soft, the air a thick, shimmering soup. Power grids strained, air conditioners failed, and the city of Atlanta baked under a relentless, oppressive sun. It was an act of nature that would, by chance, begin to unravel a decade-old, unnatural crime. The abandoned Ashcroft Children's Cancer Research Center, a place long forgotten by the city, began to bleed. Its derelict cooling systems, overwhelmed by the extreme heat, finally failed. Deep within the building's subbasement, pipes burst, releasing a slow, black chemical runoff that seeped into the ground, following the path of least resistance into the city's residential storm drains. A few days later, the calls started coming in. Residents in a nearby neighborhood reported a strange, oily black sludge backing up into their gutters, killing the grass on their lawns and leaving a faint, chemical smell in the air. The city sent out Daniel Griggs, a mid-level environmental technician, to investigate. Daniel was an unassuming man, a diligent but unremarkable city worker whose job was a series of routine, mundane problems. Sewer line blockages, illegal dumping, strange smells. This call seemed no different. He started at the affected neighborhood, following the trail of the black sludge from the storm drains back toward its source. The trail led him to a chain-link fence surrounding the sprawling, derelict campus of the old Ashcroft facility. He spent the better part of a day tracing the source of the leak through the abandoned building. The place was a wreck, a testament to a hasty departure. Old papers were scattered across office floors, dried-up coffee cups sat on desks, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. Following a series of faded schematics, he traced the runoff to a network of pipes that led down into the subbasement. The air in the subbasement was cold and damp. He followed a large, insulated refrigerant line along a concrete corridor to a section of the building that wasn't on the original plans. It was a sealed lab wing, its entrance blocked by a heavy, rusted steel hatch on the floor, like the entrance to a bunker. A faded, stenciled sign above it read, Unit 4C, expired trials, clearance revoked. Using a crowbar from his truck, Daniel managed to pry the rusted hatch open. He descended a set of steel stairs into a dark, flooded corridor. The black sludge was ankle-deep here. At the end of the corridor was a single, sealed door made of thick, reinforced glass, like a bank vault. A small, green light on the control panel next to it was still faintly humming, the only sign of life in the dead building. The glass of the door was fogged over with a thick layer of condensation. But through the fog, Daniel could see something. Fingerprints. On the inside of the glass. His heart began to pound. He wiped a clear circle on the fogged glass with the sleeve of his work shirt. He peered inside. A man was staring back at him. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and vacant. He was alive. The discovery of the man in the vault became a bizarre, sensational local news story. Kareem Monroe was in his small apartment, studying for the bar exam, when he saw the report on the evening news. The reporter was standing in front of the familiar, derelict brick facade of the Ashcroft Center. When the reporter mentioned that the man was found in a sealed, experimental research wing, a cold, electric shock went through Kareem. He immediately called his mother. "Mom," he said, his voice tight with an emotion he couldn't name. "Turn on the news. Now, I think they found him." The rescue was a delicate, surreal operation. Paramedics and a specialized hazmat team descended into the flooded corridor, their movements careful and precise. They managed to override the electronic lock on the vault door. The air that rushed out was frigid, smelling of ozone and disinfectant. The man inside was rushed to a private, secure ICU at a major Atlanta hospital. He was emaciated, his skin pale and translucent, his body covered in frostbite lesions. He was alive, but barely. The case was a baffling medical and legal mystery. Who was he? How did he get there? How had he survived? The ID panel on the outside of the vault provided the first chilling clue. It read, Patient 41B, status, unresponsive. Nutrients cycle failed 71 days ago. As the man lay in his hospital bed, a ghost hooked up to a web of modern machines. Detective Harding of the Atlanta PD began the work of identifying him. A DNA sample was rushed to the state crime lab. The results came back in less than 24 hours. The sample was a perfect match to a decade-old missing persons file, one that had been renewed annually by a persistent, grieving wife. The man was Dr. Elias Monroe, missing for 10 years, legally declared dead for 7. Althea and Kareem arrived at the hospital, their minds a whirlwind of hope and terror. A doctor met them in a small private waiting room. "He's alive," the doctor confirmed, his voice filled with a professional awe. "We don't know how, The chamber he was in seems to be a prototype for a metabolic suspension unit, designed for long-term human trial storage. The primary nutrient cycle failed, but it seems a secondary cryo-cooling system remained active. It plunged his body into a state of near hibernation, slowing his metabolism to an almost immeasurable crawl. It's the only reason he's alive. A few more weeks, and even that wouldn't have been enough. Althea was allowed into the ICU room first. She stood by the bed, her hand covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The man in the bed was a skeletal stranger, a pale echo of the vibrant, loving husband she had lost. But it was him. She knew it in her soul. She reached out and touched his hand. His skin was cold, papery. His eyes, which had been closed, fluttered open. They were clouded, distant, but they focused on her face. A flicker of recognition, of memory, of love, crossed the vast, frozen ocean of the last 10 years. He tried to speak, his voice a dry and used rasp. He wept, silent tears rolling down his gaunt cheeks. They locked me in, he whispered his first words in a decade. 2 days later, the official story was released to a media that was now in a frenzy. A press conference was held, not by the police, but by Verexon Labs, flanked by a city official. A slick, expensive-looking lawyer did the talking. Verexon Labs is shocked and saddened by the discovery at the defunct Ashcroft facility, the lawyer said, his face a mask of solemn concern. While we acquired the parent company of Ashcroft 10 years ago, all operations at that site had ceased prior to the merger. It appears this was a tragic industrial accident, where a former researcher, Dr. Monroe, accidentally locked himself inside an experimental chamber during the facility's decommissioning. We pledge our full cooperation with the authorities and our deepest sympathies to the Monroe family. Kareem and Althea watched the press conference on a small television in the hospital waiting room. Althea just shook her head, a silent tear tracing a path down her cheek. Kareem's grief was colder, sharper. "Listen to them," he muttered, his voice a low growl. "They're not even trying to be clever. Derelict facility. Accident. They're building a legal firewall. They're distancing themselves from the building, from the timeline, from him." He looked at his mother, his eyes hard with a new resolve. "They think they can bury him again, this time in lies. But they're wrong. They made one mistake. They left a witness." The investigation that followed was a quiet, brutal war fought not in the streets, but in hospital rooms, law offices, and the memories of those who had been paid to forget. While the world saw a medical miracle, Kareem Monroe and a handful of dedicated officials saw the outlines of a monstrous corporate conspiracy. Elias, his strength slowly returning, began to speak. His testimony, given a halting, whispery voice to a state investigator, was the key. He described the last day. He had gone to Ashcroft to retrieve his samples. He had been met in his lab by Dr. Kessler and 2 men in security uniforms. Kessler had told him there was a small contamination issue and that he needed to undergo a standard decontamination protocol. It was a lie. The coffee they gave him was drugged. He remembered feeling dizzy, a strange, heavy paralysis creeping through his limbs. He remembered being strapped to a gurney, the ceiling tiles of the corridor sliding past above him. He remembered being loaded into the cold, sterile vault. His last conscious thought a flash of Kessler's face, his expression not of malice, but of cold, clinical necessity. He had woken up in the dark, a tube in his arm, the low hum of the machine his only companion. He had a new identity, a plastic bracelet on his wrist that read, Patient 41B. He was part of a trial he had never consented to, a program whose name he had glimpsed on a monitor before the door was sealed, EPH, Ethics Preservation Hold. The goal was clear: silence him without the messy legal complications of killing him. He was not a patient. He was intellectual property being stored in a legal black hole. As his father provided the what, Kareem, using his legal training, began to uncover the how. He focused his investigation on former Ashcroft employees. Most remembered nothing, their memories wiped clean by generous severance packages and non-disclosure agreements. But Kareem was relentless. After weeks of searching through old employment records, he finally found her, a retired nurse named Brenda, who had worked in the records department at Ashcroft before it was shut down. She lived in a small town 2 hours outside of Atlanta. Kareem met her in a quiet, anonymous coffee shop off the highway. Brenda was a woman in her late 60s with kind but terrified eyes. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely lift her cup of tea. "I don't know why you're talking to me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I just worked in records. I don't know anything." "I think you do, Brenda," Kareem said gently, his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm not here to get you in trouble. I'm here because my father, Dr. Elias Monroe, spent 10 years in a box in that building, and I want to know why." Brenda flinched at the name. "They told us Unit 4C was for long-term equipment testing," she said, reciting the old company line. "They said the sounds were just simulators." "You knew that wasn't true, didn't you?" Kareem pressed, leaning forward. "You heard things." The woman's composure finally broke. Tears welled in her eyes. "I heard a man's voice once," she whispered, her voice cracking. A muffled groan. It sounded like he was in pain. "I reported it to my supervisor. He told me I was mistaken. He told me it was a test dummy with a motion simulator. And then he told me that if I ever mentioned it again, my pension would be in jeopardy and that Verexon had very good lawyers. I had a family to support. I was scared." "I understand," Kareem said, his voice soft with an empathy that was genuine. "But you're not scared anymore, are you, Brenda? You're here." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a decade of guilt. "I couldn't live with it. Not after I saw his face on the news. He was real." She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope, her hands shaking as she slid it across the table. "I copied these before I was laid off. I don't know why. I guess my conscience wouldn't let me throw them away. I was too afraid to ever do anything with them." Kareem opened the envelope. The memos were the smoking gun. They were cold, corporate speak for an abduction. Trial 41B. Subject is resistant to IP acquisition. ROI negative. 1 red, signed by Bernard Kessler. Initiate EPH protocol. Erase and preserve. Do not revive without sea-level clearance. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Kareem, using his father's notes, ran a comparison. Verexon Labs' new blockbuster chemotherapy drug, Verexitol, a drug that was earning them billions, had a molecular structure that was 89% similar to his father's gentle, non-toxic compound. But the small changes Verexon had made to secure a new patent had rendered it far more toxic, its side effects brutal. The conspiracy was laid bare. They hadn't just silenced his father. They had stolen his life's work, corrupted it for profit, and left him to rot in a cold storage vault, a ghost in a glass coffin, while children died in the world outside. He wasn't supposed to wake up. The unearthing of the truth did not lead to a swift and righteous justice. It led to a slow, cynical, and ultimately successful cover-up by an army of high-priced corporate lawyers. The whistleblower nurse's testimony was attacked, her credibility questioned. The memos were dismissed as unverified documents of unclear origin. Dr. Bernard Kessler, now the celebrated chief science officer of Verexon, went silent, surrounded by a legal team that deflected every inquiry. He issued a single, terse statement expressing his deepest sympathies for the unfortunate accident that had befallen his former colleague. The other board members from Ashcroft had long since scattered. One had died of supposed overdose years earlier. Another had fled the country to a nation with no extradition treaty. The trail officially went cold. The statute of limitations on kidnapping had expired. Kareem Monroe, now a fully licensed attorney, met with the district attorney, a slick, ambitious politician named Reynolds. They sat in Reynolds' expansive office, the city skyline gleaming behind him. "This is an incredible story, Mr. Monroe," Reynolds said, steepling his fingers. "A true triumph of the human spirit. And you have my deepest sympathies." "I'm not here for sympathy, Mr. Reynolds," Kareem said, his voice cold. "I'm here for an indictment. I gave your office the memos. You have my father's testimony. You have the nurse's statement. You have the chemical analysis of Verexitol. This is a conspiracy to commit kidnapping, false imprisonment, and intellectual property theft on a massive scale." Reynolds sighed, a sound of practiced regret. Kareem. May I call you Kareem? Your father's testimony, after 10 years of traumatic confinement and induced hibernation, would be torn apart on the stand. The memos, their chain of custody, is questionable. The nurse, she's a disgruntled former employee. Verexon would bury us and your family. In a decade of litigation, we cannot afford to lose. The statute of limitations on the kidnapping has passed. Proving intent for the other charges, it's a legal minefield. So, you're not going to file charges? Kareem stated, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. I am officially declining to file criminal charges, citing a lack of sufficient, admissible evidence to secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, Reynolds said, the words a perfectly rehearsed legal shield. I'm sorry, son. My hands are tied. The system had once again protected its own. Elias Monroe, his body still frail, his voice still a whisper, gave a single, powerful public statement from the steps of the hospital upon his release. He stood, supported by Althea and Kareem, and faced the bank of news cameras, his eyes clear and defiant. I was never unstable, he said, his voice gaining strength with every word. I was inconvenient. My research was a threat to a business model that profits from sickness. So they did not debate me. They did not try to disprove my science. They erased me. They kept me cold until they thought the world and my family would forget me. They were wrong. His words were a brief firestorm, a story of incredible survival and corporate evil that captured the nation's attention for a few weeks before fading, as all such stories do, from the relentless churn of the 24-hour news cycle. The vault itself, the cold, sterile tomb, was removed from the defunct facility. It was acquired by a university medical ethics program, a silent, chilling monument to a crime that would go unpunished. The years that followed were a quiet, difficult journey. Elias would never fully recover. He would live out his days in the gentle, loving care of his family, a man out of time, forever haunted by the decade of darkness. Kareem, now a respected civil rights attorney, fought for years to publish his father's work. He finally managed to recover a corrupted zip drive from the vault's internal systems, a ghost of his father's research journal. Years later, a bright, ambitious medical student, working on her doctoral thesis, stumbled upon the fragmented data Kareem had published online. She used the remnants of Dr. Monroe's work as a footnote in her own research on non-toxic cancer therapies. It was the first time his name had appeared in a formal academic text since 1988. His legacy, like him, had been resurrected, if only in a whisper. The final image is not of a dramatic courtroom victory. It is of a child in a sterile hospital room, wincing as a nurse administers a dose of the toxic, expensive chemotherapy that made Verexon Labs billions. The child will never know the name of the man who tried to make their treatment painless, the man who was silenced so that a corporation could profit. The world still hasn't cured cancer. One evening, months after his release, Elias sat with Althea and Kareem in the quiet of their living room, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. He was still frail, wrapped in a thick blanket, but his eyes were clear. You know, he said, his voice a soft, raspy whisper. The worst part, the most agonizing part of it all, wasn't the cold. It wasn't the darkness. He looked at Kareem, then at Althea, his eyes filled with a profound, soul-deep sorrow. It was knowing that they were still out there. The children, the ones I was trying to help. I would lie there in the dark, and I would picture their faces. And I knew that while I was frozen, they were still getting sick. They were still being pumped full of the poisons I was trying to replace. He took a shaky breath, and then I realized the true nature of the evil. They didn't just steal my life. They stole my work, and they twisted it. They took something pure, something gentle, and they reverse-engineered it. They found a way to make it just different enough to patent, and just toxic enough to fit their business model. They're not just selling a cure, they're selling the sickness that goes with it. The real tragedy isn't that they buried me. It's that they buried my work, and they're selling the world a gilded counterfeit in its place. Kareem reached out and put a hand on his father's shoulder. But they didn't win, Dad. You're here. We have the truth. Elias looked at his son, then at his wife, the two people who had refused to forget him. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. Yes, he whispered. We have the truth. It was the only justice they would ever get.